Welcome to our bonus episode of Pirate Predator. And a reminder that this episode will contain references to child sexual abuse. Since we started making this series, we've been asking listeners to get in touch with us if they've any knowledge of Éamon Cook. We're still receiving new information even after our final episode has been published, and to date we've heard from over 90 people, including victims speaking out for the very first time, alongside others who have provided insights and observations into Cook. This information has been invaluable in helping us tell the overall story of Éamon Cook. Even though we were able to feature much of the information we received within the series itself, we just couldn't fit everything in, including the full statements we received from some of Éamon Cook's children. And so to begin, here's the full statement from the woman who bore Éamon Cook's first child as a young teenager in the early 1980s, and whose life Cook later endangered through a firebombing attack.
I was a victim of Éamon Cook from the age of 13. Today, we have words for what happened to me. Child sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, statutory rape, coercive control, psychological abuse, violence and threats, complete control. Éamon Cook never served 1 hour in prison for what he did to me. That is a hurt that is triggered every time this case is discussed. The cost of getting away from him was the petrol bombing and years of harassment that followed. At the time of the petrol bombing, I was living alone with my child in a different location. The house that was petrol bombed was not an empty property. There was also an upstairs flat occupied by 2 people who could have lost their lives that night. At that time, I was dating a young man. There was no affair. He was targeted because of his association with me. I did occasionally visit his flat, and had we been there on the night of the attack, we could both have been killed. Had my child been there, they too could have lost their life. All of those involved took that risk. As referenced in the podcast, none of those involved served prison time for their part in an attack that could have easily resulted in multiple deaths. Éamon Cook changed his plea to guilty on the morning of his trial. He left the court accompanied by an underage girl. As witnesses, we were left to watch proceedings unfold while he ultimately avoided serving a prison sentence. That remains a source of profound hurt. I do not know why Éamon Cook later said he organised the petrol bomb, nor do I know what was said about me during his sentencing hearing. To this day, I have never received any explanation. The harassment continued for years. On one occasion, at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, a drill bit was thrown through the living room window of my 4th floor flat. The next window along was my child's bedroom, where my child was asleep. Éamon Cook, I saw him walk away afterwards. I reported what had happened, but once again I felt I was treated like a criminal rather than a victim. Nothing was done. I lived in absolute terror. The Gardaí treated me and the other witnesses in this case with little compassion. I repeatedly spoke out and tried to raise concerns over many years, but to no avail. I have stood in many courts as a witness. For all of this, I feel I received no justice. In 1986, newspaper reports described me as Éamon Cook's girlfriend. In 2026, people finally recognised the truth. I was not his girlfriend, I was his victim. I am a survivor, but there has been a huge cost to surviving what I lived through. There has also been a cost for my family. Right now, I cannot fully tell my story. The Irish courts did that to me. They took away my voice. This is my statement. This is my truth. I have lived with the consequences for decades.
We also received statements from some of Éamon Cook's children. Again, some of these were used in previous episodes, but we can now hear the first of those full statements from someone whom we're referring to as Child A.
People have often described me as one of the lucky ones because I did not experience Éamon Cook's abuse firsthand. But I do not see myself as lucky, and I think that way of framing it misses the reality of what his actions did to the lives of his children. Although I never knew him and never had anything to do with him, my whole life trajectory was shaped by who he was and what he did. It was his actions that traumatised my siblings and affected my ability to have close relationships with many of them. So while I may not have experienced his abuse directly, I still grew up in the fallout of it. A huge part of my life was shaped by questions about where I came from, who I was, and why my life had taken the course it had. Those are questions every child deserves honest answers to, yet so much of what I came to know was through Googling media articles, hearing fragments from other people, and trying to piece together a story that should never have been mine to carry. That leaves a deep and lasting impact. There was also a stigma that came with it. Growing up, there was always the fear that people would connect my surname to him, even though I never knew him and had no part in the things that he had done. That fear stays with you. It affects your sense of identity, your sense of safety, and how you move through the world. It means carrying shame, judgment, questions, and assumptions that do not belong to you, but that you are forced to live with anyway. I think it is important for people to understand that harm does not end with the direct victims. It ripples out into the lives of the children and families left behind. It shapes relationships, identity, belonging, and the future. It is something that continues long after the crimes themselves. Even now, one of the hardest realities is knowing that one day I will have to explain this history to my own children. I find it hard to put into words the disgust I feel when I think about the kind of person Éamon Cook was and the things he did. I never knew him and would never have wanted to know him. But even without knowing him, I have lived with the consequences of his actions for my entire life. There were children like me whose lives were still profoundly shaped by him, even if the harm came in different ways. I may not have been one of his direct victims, but I was still one of the children left to live in the shadow of what he had done. Thank you.
About half of the tips sent through to us were sent via our anonymous portal, rte.ie/pirate predator. Others via our email, documentaries@rte.ie. And we can now listen through some of those, which stretch right back to the early 1950s.
He sat beside me in St. Vincent's Secondary, Glasnevin. I remember the detectives arresting him in the class for the bombing of Glasnevin Cemetery Monument. He told me he was the lookout at the cemetery gates.
Another listener who got in touch sounds like they might have had a very lucky escape as a child.
Myself and my friend used to go to the station on a Sunday afternoon to answer the phones. The station was a room in the back of the house. One time we were there and Cook offered to take us out in his green Jaguar to get ice cream. We were so excited, but a woman at the station jumped up and said she was coming too. We all piled into the car and Cook and herself were arguing. She always seemed on edge and we thought she was just being mean, not letting us sit up front. But when I look back, she was probably protecting us.
Another person who got in touch with us gave us some insight into just why Radio Dublin was so popular with young children.
As a child growing up in Inchicore in the early to mid-80s, we generally weren't aware of how dangerous Éamon Cook was. It was probably like a dirty secret nobody wanted to talk about. Therefore, no child had been warned to stay away from the Radio Dublin premises. So the thing that constantly attracted kids to the house was the promise of free stickers and posters that were on offer. Back then, kids loved free stickers and the like. I feel this was an easy way for Cook to attract local kids to his house. It's probably a small point, but I wonder now how many children got tangled in Cook's web as a result of this. It's definitely a thing in Inchicore for children to regularly visit there looking for freebies.
We also received a statement from another of Éamon Cook's children, who we'll refer to as Child B.
I understand that RTE say they contacted our family out of courtesy regarding this documentary. However, from my perspective, it does not feel like a courtesy. It feels like the past is being brought back into the public eye once again, without any new evidence or developments, and it forces our family to relive something we have spent years trying to move on from. The crimes associated with my father are well known and have caused enormous harm to many people. The victims deserve compassion and recognition for what they endured. At the same time, his children have also had to live with the consequences of his actions for most of our lives. Many of us are now parents ourselves and are trying to build normal lives for our own families. But stories like this bring everything back up again. I also feel it is important to say that some things reported over the years have been presented publicly as fact, even when the situation was not always so clear. For example, there were reports about a letter connected to the disappearance of Philip Carnes being found among my father's belongings. After my father passed away, I personally had possession of his belongings and went through them myself. I kept some personal items such as photographs and other family things, and the rest were either donated or disposed of. From my own experience of handling his belongings, that account about a letter being found among his possessions is not how events unfolded. Unfortunately, once something is reported publicly, it can continue to circulate as fact even when the reality is different. I was also with my father in the weeks before he died in hospice. At that stage, he was suffering from severe dementia and often did not even recognise his own name. Whatever people believe about him, the reality at the end of his life was very different from the image often portrayed. What is particularly difficult is that documentaries and media coverage can profit from telling this story again and again, while the families who are forced to live with the aftermath receive no support. Our lives have been permanently affected by something we have no control over. Yet we are often expected to simply endure the renewed attention and public discussion that comes with it. Financially, we are left to carry the consequences of this history ourselves. While organisations can make money from retelling these events, I am in the position of struggling to afford even basic support such as therapy to deal with the impact it has had on my life. I am also currently in possession of my father's will, yet financially I have not been able to process it. I have tried to take steps to deal with it myself as far as I could, but I've been unable to find solicitors willing to assist me in sorting through it, and without legal help, I simply do not have the knowledge or resources to manage something like that on my own. This reflects the reality of the situation for our family. While the story continues to be revisited publicly, we are left dealing privately with the financial and emotional aftermath. I hope that, if my words are included in this programme, they are presented in the full and proper context. All we are trying to do now is live our lives, raise our children, and move forward from the past that we did not choose, but we have been forced to carry.
A number of people who were in touch with us can now, looking back, see just how vulnerable they were during the decades Éamon Cook was abusing children.
I won the competition on Radio Dublin and went there to collect my voucher. My friend was with me. The DJ, who was live on the radio, stopped talking and told myself and my friend to leave. I remember hearing the door open during this time. We left immediately. It was an old house with steps going up to it, and as far as I can remember, the room was on the ground floor to the rear of the house.
Another reason for visiting Cook's station could be to donate to the Radio Dublin Christmas Toy Appeal.
He launched a Radio Christmas Toy Appeal for needy kids each Christmas. He had an association with a teenage relative of mine, also some of her friends. Not sure if anything untoward was happening, but Cook was known to enjoy the presence of young girls.
Someone who very much experienced Cook at first hand was a support worker who crossed paths with him, as read now by our series producer Liam.
The first time I heard the name Éamon Cook, it was in the context of the harm he had caused to others. In the work I do, you learn quickly. But with Cook, I learned something different. What struck me most was not just the abuse itself, but the extraordinary lengths he went to in order to control everything and everyone around it. Manipulation and power were not incidental to who he was. They were the point. His reach extended far beyond his direct victims. He worked to ensure that anyone connected to his world, in whatever capacity, understood what he was capable of. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy of control. I experienced this firsthand. During the period I had professional involvement with his case, I received letters at my workplace, sent directly from his prison cell. He knew my name. He knew where I worked. He knew the names of people around me. One line has stayed with me. He wrote that he was writing to my office rather than to me directly. It was a small distinction, but the message was unmistakable. He was letting me know that he knew where I lived. He didn't need to say it outright. That was never his style. The implication was enough. I was left in absolutely no doubt about what he wanted me to understand. That his reach was long, that he was watching, and that he was still in control even when he was in prison. That, I think, tells you everything about the man. If he was willing to go to those lengths with someone who had only peripheral involvement, then the weight his victims have carried for decades is almost unimaginable. They were never allowed to simply be free of him. I had largely put Cook out of my mind until I heard about this series. But the moment his name came back to me, the response was immediate. A sharp, visceral reminder of just how dangerous, predatory, and calculating he was. Some things, it seems, don't fully leave you.
A listener who contacted us anonymously did so with a memory of a local incident in Inchicore which involved Éamon Cook.
I came across that filthy person one night while waiting for chips in a takeaway in Inchicore. I parked a Jaguar outside the place so I could keep an eye on the car, which was quite rare in Dublin in those days. As I was the only person in the chipper, he knew it was my car. As he barged through the door, he made his way towards me and pushed me back with his shoulder. I could see the drunken anger in his face, and I wasn't waiting for round two. I let fly with a couple of punches and he soon sobered up. In fairness to his colleague, he was having no part in it. If I'd been a soft touch, he would have had a party.
Some tips also came into us from people whose memories of Cook were when he lived beside them as a neighbour.
He had the most strangest behaviour. He owned an army truck and kids from other estates would come to play in it. The kids had a fascination for what he had in his garden. He soon got rid of the army truck and bought a JCB, again attracting kids from afar, and had no issue letting kids sit in it to play. Parents on the road didn't like the vibe from the house and most were told to stay away from him. One night he chopped a tree down in the main park that was hundreds of years old because it was interfering with his signal. Yeah, he was operating Radio Dublin from the box bedrooms. He had cameras in the house. We have learned this was for protection from Garda raids and to watch neighbours and kids. He chased local teenagers in his JCB because they were mocking him. He built a huge extension on the side of his house all during the night. He'd go off during night in the JCB and come back at 2 a.m. and start building. Neighbours started to get the measure of him and would joke at what he had buried under those foundations. Little did we know what was about to be revealed. He was always in a grubby suit jacket, smoke hanging out of his mouth. He was very vindictive, and if you pissed him off on the road, like reporting him or looking at him funny, he would sabotage something you owned, or he would chase you in his car or JCB. He was known as a madman in our estate. No kid was allowed near him or his family.
Another person who also grew up near where Cook once lived shared similar memories.
We used to climb on his wall to look in his back garden at his radio station. When he walked through the estate, we knew to cross the road. He was the Cookie Monster. We didn't know the reason behind it being kids, but we knew he was a dangerous man.
And there was a listener who got in touch with us with an upsetting disclosure, read here by one of our producers, Shauna.
My sister always said she was aware of his abuse. She saw him taking other young kids into his house. She gave evidence in court. And apparently my older sister was also abused by him. Although I only heard this through a third party, albeit one I trust.
And then a listener contacted us with memories of the time Éamon Cook helped Fianna Fáil set up their radio station around one of the 1982 general elections.
The Fianna Fáil station was broadcast from O'Connell Street, if my memory serves me well. It was either in or next door to the old CIE building opposite the Gresham. I personally witnessed the Fianna Fáil minister dealing with Cook on the matter. I worked in Sarsfield Road, 1978, and Inchicore Road till 1983. I loathed Cook, but for the sake of truth, never ever encountered anything like a paedophile ring. He was a loner. There were never any men visiting the station.
Another listener emailed us with what they believed could be relevant information.
Just listened to your podcast about Éamon Cook and spoke to my husband about it.
He remembers transporting a container from Tala to the Dublin mountains. He remembers a young girl holding a baby and also small children. Cook was digging on the side of the mountain, made a comment that this would be a fine place to bury a body.
We also received emails from people asking for a direct phone call. Among those was a retired Garda from the southeast who shared a disturbing memory from the 1970s. When he was around 10 years old, he and his friends were cycling along a rural road when a rare Jaguar car passed them, stopped and reversed. The driver got out, claimed he was hunting rabbits and asked the boys for help. They followed him into a field where the man's behaviour suddenly shifted. He grew overly energetic, wrestling the boys and dragging them to the ground under the guise of playing. It was only after the man drove away that the boys realised how inappropriate the encounter had been. He had groped and assaulted each of them. Years later, looking back on the incident, the retired Garda tried to track down the driver. Knowing how uncommon Jaguar cars were in 1970s Ireland, he eventually identified the man as Éamonn Cook after seeing his photograph in later newspaper reports. The next account was sent to us just days ago, and it sent shivers up my spine. It comes from a woman in East Galway who remembers an incident in 1976 when she was just 10 years old.
I was walking with a friend who was 12 years old and I was pushing my baby sister in her pram. We were near a bridge over the Shannon when a shabby-looking man approached us. He asked, "Do you think there are any mermaids in the Shannon?" To give you an idea of how innocent we were, we actually started discussing the likelihood of finding mermaids there. The man told us he was down from Dublin on his holidays, but then a woman arrived. The man was clearly waiting for her and she quickly pulled him away. A little while later, we were still walking when a car pulled up and halted right in front of us. It was the same man. This time, he was driving a very nice car. That's something I distinctly remember. He started talking about mermaids again. He asked me what my favourite part of a mermaid was, and I said, their hair. And he said, I've a different favourite bit, their backsides. My friend and I thought this was disgusting. Then he said, because you can do lots with a backside. I have girls in Dublin who show me their bottoms and I give them 50p. My friend, who was 2 years older than me, screamed, turned and ran off as fast as she could. Not knowing what else to do, I chased after her, frantic, pushing the pram. Her house wasn't far away and we ran inside and slammed the door behind us. I hadn't thought about that day for 50 years. Then last week, I was listening to your podcast. I like to Google the people involved just to see what they look like. When I looked up Éamonn Cook, I nearly died. It was him. It was the man who had stopped us by the bridge. I also showed my friend the photo and she gasped, "That's him," she said. "That's the man." 50 years on, I remember his face like it was yesterday. It now seems we had a very lucky escape.
Another of Éamonn Cook's children, who we're referencing as Child C, gave an interview to Emma McManus in the Irish Mirror just a few weeks after Éamonn Cook died in June 2016. At the time, there was a sharp focus on Éamonn Cook potentially being responsible for the disappearance of Philip Kearns. We used some of that interview in our final episode, but we can hear it here in full now, and it gives some further insights. Again, read by one of our producers, Shauna.
Yes, I would agree he would have abused any child, but there is being manipulative and then there's being violent and killing somebody. They are two completely different things. If someone said he had abused them as a child, I would say there are many, many victims we don't know about. To go as far as murder, I wouldn't think so. I only saw him once in prison, a year ago, and he had Alzheimer's. He went to prison when I was 9. As far as I am concerned, yes, he would have assaulted children, but I don't know to the degree that people are obviously saying. I'm not denying that my dad ever abused kids. Yes, he absolutely did, and that's what he is in prison for. But as soon as he died, people are now coming out with allegations where there is no proof to back it up. But everyone is going to believe it because he is dead now. They are all saying that my dad turned around to the guards and said he knew who Philip was. But in the last year that my dad was dying, he had Alzheimer's. He wouldn't have been able to confirm anything. He didn't even know who half his children were, never mind someone from 30 years ago. Nobody has stated that anywhere. Not even the guards themselves have clarified that. In the last couple of days, he was unconscious. He never regained consciousness for 3 days, and it was only the week before that the guards were in to speak to him. He wouldn't have known anything. I was there most days in the hospice. He wouldn't have made any sense, to be honest. He was that far gone that the day after the guards were there, me and my dad were watching SpongeBob in Irish. He didn't know where the hell he was. Before he even died, I did tell him that I forgave him. It was for myself, but also for the fact that being an Irish person, you're meant to respect the dead, basically. And I don't believe anyone should die with so much guilt. It was also to give him peace. I think everyone, no matter who someone is, they deserve peace.
When asked if her father, Éamon Cook, ever showed any signs of remorse to any of his victims, Child C replied,
Honestly, I would never know. But when I went to see him in the hospice, when I was far older, he did treat me completely differently. He did turn around to me after I had seen him and said he had been thinking about me a lot. He tried to have a conversation with me, but I didn't want to hear it. I just said, I have already told you I forgive you. There is no point in going over this again. I didn't have a very good childhood.
It was only in the last few days that we were contacted by a woman who emailed us outlining how she believes she also had a lucky escape from Éamon Cook.
In the summer of 1992, I was on work placement in Enniscree Lodge Hotel, Glencree, County Wicklow. I was a naive 19-year-old, and on one of my days off, I got a lift to Enniskerry Gardens. He had an oldish classic type car that I think was a yellow or cream colour. When I got in, he insisted on helping me with the seatbelt, which I found a bit uncomfortable, but didn't pass much remarks, as to me he just seemed like a nice man. On the journey, he asked me a lot of questions, and I told him where I was working. When he found out I was 19, he remarked more than once that I looked much younger. At this point, something clicked, and I realised I needed to get away from this person. He bragged about being a DJ and had his own studio in Dublin, and was dropping names and kept saying, I'll take you there someday, show you around, etc. At this point, I'm trying to work out how I can get away from this creep. When we got to the village of Enniskerry, I asked to get out there, but he wanted to bring me back to the hotel I worked at. So for the first time, I insisted what I wanted, and that was to be let out in the village at the shop. As we neared the shop, I was praying he would stop to let me out, and he did. I was crying and very shaken. Fast forward a few days, and he called the hotel to speak to me. Again, I was too meek to tell him to fuck off, and I can't quite recall the conversation, but I was very monosyllabic in my answers in the hope he would take the hint. He had the audacity to call again a few days later, and he told the owner who answered the phone that he was my father, so I took the call and realised it was this creep. At the same time, the head chef saw me taking the phone and going white, but in typical chef style, he lambasted him and told him he would kill him if he ever called me again. I realised years later, when articles started coming out about Éamon Cook, that it was the same man and how lucky I was. The good news is I'm 53 years old now, and I'm no longer meek or timid, and thankfully still look young for my age.
Another listener got in touch with suspicions that Éamon Cook might have been involved with others in the abuse of children.
There was a man around that time and into the 80s who used to hang around the pirate stations. He abused children. Given that paedophiles tend to gravitate towards each other, I wonder if he was involved with Cook. He spoke about knowing all the DJs at the time and how he spent a lot of time at the stations. He told me he was involved with them, but I don't know in what capacity. There have been a number of complaints made about him and different people over the years. It would not surprise me at all if he was involved in the abuse that happened with Cook.
Another contact we received was from a woman who is now a nun, but whose childhood memories of Cook and Radio Dublin give us a sense of the aura and power Radio Dublin gave to Éamon Cook, especially in the eyes of children.
Back in 1987, I was a very shy, introverted and socially awkward teenager who stayed mostly at home with my parents and siblings. At home, my solace was my radio, and I spent hours and hours alone in my bedroom listening to music and Radio Dublin. In 1988, the government passed a law making pirate radio stations illegal, and they were all forced to close down. It was a terrible grief for me. I cried so much and felt it was an awful thing to happen. Very soon, Radio Dublin were back on air, and that station became my obsession. For me, Radio Dublin gave me a sense of autonomy and being rebellious, and so it wasn't long before I wanted to visit the studio in person. I was about 15 the first time I went there in 1989. But I really wanted to meet the captain, cook, the owner. One day, as I was in the studio with maybe one or two of the DJs, Éamon Cook came in with a cigarette in his mouth. He did not look at me directly, but I spoke to him and said how much I liked the station. He never stayed around long. He would come in and out, but it was always a thrill for me to have met the captain. Eventually, as I got older, the novelty wore off, and I stopped going to visit the radio station. When I heard on the news about Éamon Cook's abuse of women and children, I felt very shocked and also scared and very, very relieved. I realised that I dodged a bullet. I was so close to him and I got away with it. I was the lucky one. I feel so much sadness for the women and children who were not so lucky. I ache for them.
As the calls for a public inquiry into the actions of Éamon Cook grow, as his victims seek some sense of a wider justice and understanding of how he was able to abuse with apparent immunity for over 50 years. We leave you with an email we received after our final episode was published, which suggests that the depths of Éamon Cook's story are yet to be fully uncovered. It's read here by one of our producers, Nicoline.
I've just listened to your excellent documentary series. Well done for following this story. I didn't know Éamon Cook personally, but as I worked in independent radio for many, many years, he was discussed, as you can imagine, in radio circles. When the stories arose again a couple of years ago, I actually contacted the Gardaí about Cook and two other men in connection with a live case, one of whom is still alive. I'm aware all three men were known to each other. There are coincidences that are far too obvious, and I therefore personally believe there's another story or series in the background of him and his friends. If you wish to give me a call, I'd be more than happy to chat through this with you in confidence, and I'll then send you on some information that you can take a look at and then perhaps pursue further. I believe it's important that this story doesn't end here.
Finally, this series wouldn't exist without you, our listeners and contributors. A huge thank you to everyone who has been involved. But the true heart of Pirate Predator belongs to the survivors and the victims who have carried their stories for so long and bravely chose to share them with us. We are profoundly grateful for your trust. Until next time, goodbye.